Most people hear the name Machiavelli and immediately think evil, manipulative, cold-blooded, and that right there is the first misunderstanding. Niccolo Machiavelli was a diplomat, a political thinker, and a man who spent decades watching power up close, how it's gained, how it's held, and how it's lost. He served the Florentine Republic. He negotiated with kings and popes. And then, when the political winds shifted, he was thrown out, stripped of his position, tortured, exiled. And it was in that exile, with nothing left but his mind, that he wrote The Prince, a book that would become one of the most controversial texts in history. But here's the thing people miss. Machiavelli wasn't writing a villain's handbook. He was writing a survival guide. He looked at the world not as he wished it to be, but as it actually was. And what he saw wasn't pretty. He saw betrayal rewarded. He saw good men destroyed. He saw leaders who played by the rules get eaten alive by those who didn't. So he made a choice. He decided to tell the truth. Not the comfortable truth, not the kind wrapped in moral platitudes, the real, ugly, operational truth about how power works. And that's what made him dangerous, not because he was immoral, but because he refused to be sentimental. He didn't care about how things should work. He cared about how they do work. That distinction matters, because everything you're about to hear in this video comes from that same unflinching lens. Machiavelli doesn't preach, he doesn't moralize, he observes, he dissects, and he lays out what he's learned with a precision that still cuts over 500 years later. So, let's get into it. Machiavelli makes a claim that most people find uncomfortable. He argues that a leader who relies only on laws will not survive. Laws are for the civilized, but the world, as he sees it, is not always civilized. So he introduces a metaphor, the lion and the fox. The lion is strength, raw power, intimidation. The fox is cunning, deception, the ability to read traps before they close. And Machiavelli's point is simple. You can't just be one. You need both. A leader who is all lion, all brute force, will eventually walk into a trap he didn't see coming. He'll be outmaneuvered, outsmarted, destroyed not by someone stronger, but by someone cleverer. And a leader who is all fox, all cunning, no backbone, will be seen as weak. And weakness in Machiavelli's world is an invitation. He points to history. Leaders who relied purely on military might were eventually undone by those who used strategy, and leaders who relied only on diplomacy and clever words were crushed the moment someone called their bluff. The key, Machiavelli argues, is knowing when to be which. There are moments that call for force, decisive, overwhelming, unmistakable. And there are moments that call for subtlety, patience, misdirection, quiet maneuvering. The mistake isn't using one or the other. The mistake is being incapable of switching between them. And this isn't just advice for rulers of nations. This principle runs through every domain where power exists: business, negotiation, conflict, relationships. Wherever there are stakes, there are lions and foxes. Machiavelli's warning is clear. If you can only roar, someone will outsmart you. If you can only scheme, someone will overpower you. Master both, or become prey to someone who has. This one's ruthless, and it's one of the most revealing examples of how Machiavelli thinks about power. He tells the story of Cesare Borgia, a leader he openly admired. Borgia had just conquered the Romagna region, and it was in chaos, lawless, violent, ungovernable. So Borgia appointed a man named Ramiro de Orco, a brutal, efficient enforcer, and gave him full authority to restore order, by any means necessary. And Ramiro did exactly that. He crushed dissent. He used fear. He brought the region to heel, but in doing so, he became hated, deeply, viscerally hated by the people. Now here's where Machiavelli reveals the real play. Once order was restored, Borgia had Ramirez seized and executed, publicly. His body was left in the town square, cut in two, with a bloody knife beside it. The message was unmistakable. Borgia positioned himself as the man who delivered justice, not the man who ordered the cruelty. The people's anger, which had been building against the regime, was redirected, absorbed by the sacrifice of one man, and Borgia walked away clean. Machiavelli doesn't flinch telling this story. He lays it out almost admiringly, because to him, this wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was calculated. It was architecture. Borgia used Ramiro as a tool, then discarded him when the tool became a liability. And the lesson Machiavelli draws is cold but precise. A wise leader must be willing to let someone else bear the cost of the dirty work, the anger, the blame. And when the time comes, that person becomes the offering, the sacrifice that preserves the leader's image. It's uncomfortable, but Machiavelli would argue that discomfort is exactly why most people lose power. There's a belief that's deeply embedded in how most people think about leadership. Be good, be fair, be kind, and people will follow you. Machiavelli looked at that belief and tore it apart. He argues plainly, without apology, that a leader who tries to be good all the time will inevitably be destroyed. Not because goodness is wrong, but because he's surrounded by people who are not good. And that asymmetry, that's what kills him. See, Machiavelli isn't saying morality has no place. He's saying something far more uncomfortable, that a leader who refuses to learn how to not be good when the situation demands it is essentially handing his enemies the knife, and they will use it. He'd seen it firsthand. The political landscape of Renaissance Italy was littered with rulers who played fair and got crushed by those who didn't. The nice prince gets praised, then he gets overthrown, and the one who replaces him, rarely nicer. And here's the part that really stings. He warns that the leader who is generous to everyone eventually has nothing left to give. So he raises taxes, the people turn on him, and now he's not the generous leader anymore. He's the desperate one. So Machiavelli's advice isn't be cruel. It's something harder to accept. Be willing to act against your own virtue if that's what survival requires. A good leader isn't always a good person, and a good person doesn't always make a good leader. That's the trade-off he forces you to confront. Most political philosophy starts with an optimistic view of humanity. People are rational. People are fair. People deep down want to do the right thing. Machiavelli starts somewhere else entirely. He describes men as ungrateful, fickle, false, cowardly, and covetous. That's not an insult. That's his diagnosis. And everything he builds, every strategy, every warning, sits on top of that foundation. Now, does he mean every single person is like this? Not exactly, but he argues that a leader must govern as if they are, because the moment you assume the best in people, you leave yourself exposed to the worst in them, and in politics, that exposure is fatal. Machiavelli warns that people will stand beside you when things are easy. When danger is far away, they'll swear loyalty, offer their blood, their property, their lives. But the moment the threat is real, the moment sacrifice actually costs something, they turn, they vanish, they find a new leader to swear loyalty to. He's not bitter about this, he's clinical. He treats human selfishness the way a doctor treats disease, not with outrage, but with clear-eyed understanding. You don't get angry at a fever, you prepare for it. And that's what separates Machiavelli from the moralists who came before him. They wrote about how people should behave. he wrote about how people actually behave. That gap between the ideal and the real is where most leaders fall, because they plan for the world they wish existed, not the one they're actually standing in. So when he calls people ungrateful and deceitful, he's not being cynical for the sake of it. He's giving you the operating conditions. This is the terrain. These are the people you will lead. Now plan accordingly. That's the challenge he lays at your feet. This is probably the most famous question Machiavelli ever raised. Is it better to be loved or feared? And his answer has been debated, misquoted, and stripped of context for over 500 years. He states it clearly. Ideally, a leader should be both loved and feared. But since the two rarely coexist, since having both is extremely difficult, he concludes that it is far safer to be feared than loved. And the reasoning isn't complicated. It's brutally simple. Machiavelli argues that love is held together by a chain of obligation, and because people are, as he's already established, selfish by nature, they will break that chain the moment it serves them to do so. Love is conditional. Love is fragile. Love depends entirely on the other person's willingness to keep giving it. But fear is held by a dread of punishment that never abandons you. It doesn't depend on someone else's goodwill. It depends on their self-interest. And self-interest, Machiavelli knows, is the one thing you can always count on. But, and this is the part people always leave out, he draws a hard line. Be feared, yes, but never hated, because hatred breeds the kind of desperation that makes people reckless. A hated ruler doesn't just face opposition, he faces people with nothing left to lose, and that's the most dangerous force in politics. So he warns leaders to avoid seizing people's property and their women. Touch someone's inheritance, he says, and they will forgive the death of their father before they forgive the loss of their patrimony. That line alone tells you everything about how deeply Machiavelli understood what drives people. Fear keeps order. Hatred destroys it. And the leader who can't tell the difference between the two won't last long enough to learn. Most people think of religion as sacred, untouchable, beyond politics. Machiavelli didn't. He saw religion for what it is in the hands of a ruler, a mechanism, a lever, one of the most powerful tools a leader can wield. Not because it's true, but because people believe it's true. And belief, real, deep, unquestioning belief, is the most controllable force on earth. In the Discourses, Machiavelli points to ancient Rome, not to its legions, not to its senators, to its religion. He argues that Numa Pompilius, Rome's second king, used religion to civilize a rough, violent population that laws alone couldn't tame. Numa didn't need to prove the gods were real. He just needed people to act as if they were. And they did. They obeyed. They fought harder. They held together as a society. Religion gave Rome something that swords couldn't: internal order. And that's the key. Machiavelli doesn't care whether God exists. That's a question for theologians. He cares about what religion does, what it produces. Does it make people obedient? Does it make soldiers brave? Does it make the state stable? Then it's useful. And if it's useful, a wise ruler protects it, promotes it, and wraps himself in it, whether he believes a single word of it or not. He warns, though, that when religion decays, when the clergy become corrupt and the institution loses credibility, the state suffers, not because heaven is angry, but because the tool has broken. People stop believing, and when belief dies, the obedience that came with it dies too. This is Machiavelli at his most unsentimental. Religion isn't about the soul, it's about the state. It's not about salvation, it's about control. And any ruler who doesn't understand that is already losing a weapon he didn't even know he had. Here's something Machiavelli understood that most people learn too late. Transparency is not a virtue in power, it's a liability. He argues in The Prince that a ruler must be a master of appearances. You don't show people who you are, you show them what they need to see. There's a difference, a massive one, and the men who confuse honesty with strategy, they don't last. Machiavelli compares the ideal ruler to a fox, not a lion. The lion is strong, sure, but the lion walks into traps. The fox sees them. The fox moves carefully. The fox never reveals its full intentions, because the moment your enemy knows your plan is dead. And this isn't just about enemies, it's about allies too. Machiavelli warns that even those closest to you should never hold your complete trust. Not because they're evil, but because loyalty shifts, interests change, and the person who knows everything about you today holds a weapon they can use against you tomorrow. So what does a Machiavellian leader do? He controls the narrative. He says enough to appear open, but never so much that he's exposed. He projects confidence without revealing doubt, strength without showing strain. He lets people believe what serves him, and he corrects only what threatens him. This is the art of strategic ambiguity. Machiavelli doesn't call it lying, though it often looks like it. He calls it survival. Because in politics, in war, in any arena where power is contested, the person who is fully transparent is fully vulnerable. You want to be an open book? Fine. But Machiavelli would tell you, open books get read, studied, and then used against the author. Keep some pages sealed. Keep some chapters hidden. That's not deception. That's intelligence. Machiavelli had a relationship with fate that was complicated. He didn't deny its power, but he refused to surrender to it. In The Prince, he introduces one of his most provocative ideas, that fortune controls roughly half of human affairs. The other half? That belongs to us, to our will, our preparation, our ability to act. He calls this virtù, not virtue in the moral sense, but something closer to raw capability, skill, nerve, the readiness to move when the moment demands it. And then he drops the metaphor that's followed him for centuries. He compares fortune to a woman, and he argues that fortune favors the bold, those who approach it with force and daring, not with caution and hesitation. Now, the language is rough, it's a product of its time, but strip away the 16th century framing and the core idea is sharp. Fortune doesn't reward the passive. It doesn't reward the careful planner who waits for the perfect moment, because the perfect moment doesn't exist. Machiavelli points to leaders who had everything, talent, resources, opportunity, but hesitated, and they were destroyed, not by a stronger enemy, by time itself, by the shifting of circumstances they thought they could wait out. You can't wait out fortune. You either ride it or it runs you over. But he also warns against arrogance. Fortune is not something you conquer permanently. It's a river, he says. In calm times, you build dams and levees. You prepare, so that when the flood comes, and it always comes, you're not swept away. This is Machiavelli's ultimate balancing act. Respect the power of chance, but never, never use it as an excuse for inaction. The bold don't always win, but the timid almost always lose. Most people think staying neutral is the safe play. You don't pick a side, you don't make enemies. Sounds reasonable. But Machiavelli calls it one of the most dangerous mistakes a leader can make. Here's his logic. When two powers are in conflict and you sit on the sidelines, you don't earn the respect of either one. The winner looks at you and sees someone who didn't help when it mattered. They owe you nothing. And the loser? They look at you and see someone who could have tipped the scales, but chose to watch. So now you've got no allies, no gratitude, no leverage. You played it safe and ended up with the worst possible outcome. Machiavelli argues that committing to a side, even the wrong side, is better than standing in the middle. Because at least when you commit, you build a bond with whoever you backed. There's shared risk, shared sacrifice, and that creates loyalty. Neutrality creates nothing. And he's not just talking about war, he's talking about any situation where a decision is demanded and you refuse to make one. In politics, in alliances, in life. Fence-sitting isn't diplomacy, it's weakness dressed up as wisdom. He warns that people who try to please everyone end up pleasing no one. And the moment the dust settles, the neutral party is the first to be discarded. Because neither side trusts someone who wouldn't take a stand when it counted. There's a hard truth buried in this. Neutrality feels like control. It feels like you're above the conflict. But Machiavelli points out that you're not above it. You're just irrelevant to it. And irrelevance, in his world, is a death sentence. You either matter or you don't. And the neutral man, he chose not to. Here's the thing, most people get wrong. Machiavelli never actually wrote those words, not once. The phrase, "the ends justify the means," doesn't appear anywhere in the prints. What he actually wrote was far more specific and far more uncomfortable. What Machiavelli argues is this: when it comes to the actions of rulers, people don't judge the process, they judge the result. If a leader uses deception, cruelty, or force, but the outcome is a stable state, a prosperous people, and lasting order, then history tends to forgive the method. Not because the method was right, but because the outcome made the method tolerable. And that's not a moral statement. It's an observation. He's not saying cruelty is good. He's saying cruelty that leads to chaos is unforgivable, but cruelty that leads to stability, people will look the other way. They always have. He points out that the masses care about their safety, their livelihood, their daily reality. They don't care how the sausage gets made. And leaders who understand this have a strategic advantage over leaders who are paralyzed by moral perfection. But, and this is where people stop reading too early, Machiavelli also warns against unnecessary cruelty, against excess, against violence that serves no purpose other than ego. He draws a sharp line between calculated ruthlessness and mindless brutality. One builds power, the other destroys it. So the phrase, "everyone loves to hate," it's a distortion, a bumper sticker version of a much deeper argument. Machiavelli isn't giving anyone permission to do whatever they want. He's saying that results are the only currency that matters in politics, and that moral posturing without results is just performance. You can disagree with him, but you can't say he wasn't paying attention. Machiavelli understood something that most leaders learn too late. People don't revolt over philosophy. They don't rise up because of abstract injustice. They revolt when they're hungry, when they're bored, when their daily lives become unbearable. Keep them fed and entertained, and you can get away with almost anything. He argues that a wise ruler doesn't need to be loved for his policies. He needs to make sure the people are comfortable enough not to question them, and that's a very different thing. It's not about earning admiration, it's about removing the motivation for resistance. This is where public spectacles, festivals, and displays of generosity come in. Machiavelli advises rulers to hold public celebrations at key moments, not because they care about the people's joy, but because it creates a feeling of normalcy, of abundance, of a ruler who provides, and a people who feel provided for are a people who stay quiet. He also warns that the worst thing a leader can do is impose heavy burdens on the populace while offering nothing in return. Taxes without benefits, restrictions without rewards. That's how resentment builds. slowly, quietly, until it's too late to contain. And here's what makes this so sharp. Machiavelli doesn't frame this as manipulation. He frames it as governance. Because in his view, every ruler is managing perception, whether they admit it or not. The only question is whether they're doing it well or badly. The principle is ancient. The Romans called it panem et circenses, bread and circuses. But Machiavelli took it further. He made it a strategic framework. Keep the people's stomachs full and their eyes entertained, and the throne stays steady. Neglect either one, and the crowd becomes a mob. Most people think power comes from what you do. Machiavelli argues it comes from what people believe you do, and that distinction, it changes everything. He makes a case that's almost uncomfortable in how true it is. A leader's reputation isn't just some byproduct of their actions. It's a weapon, a shield. Sometimes it's the only thing standing between them and destruction. Machiavelli points out that a prince who is widely believed to be strong, decisive, and just, that prince already has half the battle won before any real conflict even begins, because enemies hesitate, allies gather, and the public falls in line, not because of what's real, but because of what's perceived to be real. And here's where he gets sharp. He warns that it doesn't matter how competent you actually are if your reputation tells a different story. A capable leader with a weak reputation will be tested constantly, challenged, undermined. But a leader whose reputation radiates strength, people think twice before moving against them. That reputation does the work for them. So how does one build this kind of reputation? Machiavelli suggests it's through bold, visible action, especially early on. Grand gestures, decisive moves that people remember and talk about. He argues that a leader should actively craft the narrative around themselves. Don't leave it to chance. Don't assume people will figure out your worth on their own. They won't. But he also warns, reputation is fragile. It takes years to build and one moment of weakness to shatter. A single act of indecision, a single public humiliation left unanswered, and the armor starts to crack. Machiavelli understood something most people still refuse to accept. Perception isn't separate from reality. In the arena of power, perception is reality. This is the part of Machiavelli that people love to hate, and the part most people completely misunderstand. Machiavelli doesn't glorify lying. He doesn't celebrate dishonesty for its own sake. What he does is something far more unsettling. He treats deception as a tool, a necessary one, and he lays out exactly when and how a leader should use it. He famously argues that a prince must know how to act like both a fox and a lion. The lion fights with brute strength. The fox survives through cunning. And Machiavelli warns that relying on strength alone is a death sentence, because the world is full of traps, and only the fox sees them coming. So what does this look like in practice? He says a leader must learn the art of appearing generous, appearing merciful, appearing honest, even when the situation demands something different behind the scenes. He's not saying be dishonest all the time. He's saying don't be so chained to honesty that it destroys you. And here's the part that stings. Machiavelli observes that the people who will deceive you, rivals, allies, even the public, they won't hesitate. They won't lose sleep over it. So a leader who refuses to ever use deception isn't moral. They're just exposed. But he adds a critical layer that people always skip over. He warns that deception only works if it's rare and strategic. A leader who lies constantly becomes known as a liar, and a known liar has no power at all. The deception has to be so well placed, so well timed, that no one even suspects it happened. Machiavelli doesn't ask leaders to abandon morality. He asks them to stop pretending the world operates on morality alone. It doesn't, and the leader who understands that survives. Here's something Machiavelli understood that most ambitious people don't. Getting to the top and staying at the top, those are two completely different games. Different skills, different mindsets, different dangers. He argues that the act of seizing power requires boldness, speed, and a willingness to take enormous risks. It's offense, pure, relentless forward motion. You see the opening, you take it, and you don't look back. But the moment you have it, everything changes. Machiavelli warns that the skills that got a leader to power can actually destroy them once they're there. The aggression that won them the throne now makes them look like a tyrant. The risk-taking that seemed courageous now seems reckless. The alliances forged during the climb, they start to rot, because the people who helped you rise often expect rewards you can't or shouldn't give. He points out that maintaining power requires something most conquerors lack: patience, restraint. The ability to shift from warrior to administrator, from revolutionary to institution builder. And most leaders can't make that transition. They keep fighting wars that are already over. They keep conquering when what's needed is consolidation. Machiavelli also warns about a specific danger that comes after the seizure of power: the danger of resentment. The people you displaced, the factions you crushed, the old guard you pushed aside, they don't disappear. They wait, they watch, and the second you show weakness, they move. So what does Machiavelli prescribe? Vigilance without paranoia, strength without cruelty, and a deep understanding that the throne is never truly secure, ever. The conquest ends, but the fight for survival, that's permanent. And the leader who doesn't understand this distinction won't last. Machiavelli has no patience for indecision, none. He sees hesitation not as caution, but as a slow form of surrender. And he makes the case bluntly. In politics, in war, in any arena where power is contested, the person who waits too long doesn't get a better outcome, they get a worse one. Because while you're deliberating, your enemy is moving. While you're weighing every option, the window is closing. And once it closes, it doesn't reopen on your schedule. He warns that people convince themselves delay is wisdom. They think, I need more information, I need more time, I need to be sure. But Machiavelli argues that certainty is a luxury that rarely exists. You will almost never have the full picture, and the pursuit of perfect clarity is just fear dressed up as strategy. He points to leaders who lost everything, not because they made the wrong move, but because they made no move at all. They waited for the right moment, and that moment never came, or it came and went while they were still thinking about it. Now, does this mean you should act recklessly? No. Machiavelli isn't telling you to be impulsive. He's telling you to be decisive. There's a difference. Impulsiveness is acting without thinking. Decisiveness is thinking and then actually acting. He argues that a flawed decision made at the right time will almost always beat a perfect decision made too late. Because timing is not a secondary factor, it is the factor. A brilliant plan executed after the moment has passed is just a fantasy. So Machiavelli's message here is uncomfortable but clear. Stop waiting for permission. Stop waiting for the stars to align. The cost of hesitation is almost always greater than the cost of being wrong. This one cuts deep, and Machiavelli doesn't soften the blow. He argues that most people who call themselves nice are not actually kind. They're conflict averse. They don't say yes because they want to help. They say yes because they're afraid to say no. And that distinction matters, because kindness is a choice made from strength. But what most people practice, that's compliance made from fear. Machiavelli warns that the world does not reward people who cannot assert themselves. It consumes them. The person who always accommodates, who never pushes back, who smiles through every insult, they don't earn respect, they earn contempt. Quiet, polite contempt. And often, they don't even realize it's happening. He points out that people mistake agreeableness for virtue, but agreeableness without boundaries is not virtue. It's an invitation for others to take more, to push further, to treat you as a resource rather than a person. And here's what makes Machiavelli's observations so sharp. He doesn't say you should be cruel. He doesn't say you should be cold. He says you should be honest about why you behave the way you do. Are you being generous, or are you buying approval? Are you being patient, or are you just terrified of confrontation? He argues that real strength includes the ability to say no, to disappoint people, to hold a line when it's uncomfortable. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect. The people Machiavelli admires are not tyrants. They're individuals who understand that being liked and being respected are two very different things. And when forced to choose, they choose respect every time. So his challenge is simple. Stop hiding behind niceness as if it's a personality trait. Ask yourself, is this kindness or is this cowardice wearing a pleasant face? Machiavelli argues that rigidity is death, not eventually, quickly. He observes that the leaders who survive, the ones who actually hold power over time, are not the most principled or the most consistent. They're the most adaptable. They read the room, they read the era, and they shift accordingly, not because they lack identity, but because they understand that identity without flexibility is just stubbornness with better branding. He makes this point repeatedly. A leader who is always merciful will be exploited. A leader who is always harsh will be overthrown. The one who endures, the one who knows when to be merciful and when to be ruthless, when to speak and when to stay silent, when to advance and when to retreat. Machiavelli calls this the ability to match your nature to the times. And he warns that most people fail at this, not because they lack intelligence, but because they're prisoners of their own temperament. The cautious person stays cautious even when boldness is required. The aggressive person charges forward even when patience would win. They can't adjust, and so the moment swallows them. He points to leaders who thrived under one set of circumstances and collapsed the second conditions changed. Same person, same abilities, but the world shifted, and they didn't shift with it. So what does Machiavelli prescribe? Become fluid. Not spineless, fluid. There's a critical difference. A spineless person changes because they have no core. A fluid person changes because they have a goal, and they'll use whatever method the moment demands to reach it. The principle stays fixed, the approach stays loose, and that's what separates those who hold power from those who merely stumble into it. Adaptability isn't a betrayal of character. Machiavelli argues it is character in its most effective form. There's a belief most people hold sacred, that a man's word is his bond, that if you make a promise, you keep it, no matter what. And Machiavelli says that's a beautiful idea. It's also a dangerous one. He's blunt about this. A wise leader cannot and should not keep his word when doing so would work against him, especially when the reasons that made him give that promise no longer exist. That's not treachery for the sake of it. That's adaptation. And here's the part most people miss. Machiavelli doesn't say this because he thinks honesty is worthless. He says it because he understands something fundamental about the world, that other people will not keep their word to you. If everyone were good, then yes, keeping every promise would be the right move. But everyone is not good. And a leader who binds himself to every oath while his rivals break theirs freely, that leader will be destroyed. He uses the metaphor of the fox and the lion. The lion is strong but falls into traps. The fox recognizes traps but can't fight off wolves. You need both, strength and cunning. And cunning, by its very nature, means knowing when a promise has become a chain around your neck. But, and this is critical, Machiavelli warns that you must be a great pretender. You break your word, yes, but you never let it look like that's what you're doing. You always have a justification. A reason. A narrative that makes the broken promise seem like the only reasonable course of action. The people who get destroyed aren't the ones who break promises. They're the ones who break promises clumsily, without cover, without a story. Honesty is a tool, not a suicide pact. Machiavelli dedicates serious attention to something most people overlook: the people you surround yourself with. Not in some vague, you're the average of your 5 friends kind of way. He's far more precise than that. He argues that the first thing people judge about a leader is the quality of the advisors around him. Good advisors, people assume the leader is wise because he knew how to choose them. Bad advisors, people assume the leader is weak, and they're usually right. But here's where Machiavelli gets sharp. He warns that the greatest threat inside your circle isn't incompetence, it's flattery. A flatterer will tell you exactly what you want to hear. They'll make you feel brilliant while you're walking straight off a cliff. And the worst part? Most leaders invite this. They surround themselves with yes men because the truth is uncomfortable, because honest counsel stings. Machiavelli says a wise leader must do something that takes real discipline. He must encourage his closest advisors to speak freely, to disagree, to challenge, but only when asked and only in private, not in front of everyone, not to undermine, but to sharpen. There's a balance here, and it's razor thin. If you let everyone speak freely about everything, you lose respect. If you let no one speak freely about anything, you lose reality. And a leader disconnected from reality is already finished. He just doesn't know it yet. He also warns, choose carefully who gets access to you. Because once someone is inside your circle, they have influence. And influence, in the wrong hands, is a weapon pointed directly at you. Your inner circle will either protect you from threats you can't see, or become the threat you never saw coming. This might be the most controversial thing Machiavelli ever argued, and he knew it. He states plainly, a leader does not need to actually possess all the great virtues: mercy, honesty, faithfulness, religiousness, integrity. He doesn't need to have them. He needs to appear to have them. And Machiavelli goes further. He says that actually having all these qualities and practicing them at all times is harmful. Dangerous, even. Why? Because the world doesn't reward genuine virtue consistently. Sometimes mercy gets exploited. Sometimes honesty gets you outmaneuvered. Sometimes faithfulness ties your hands when you need to act decisively. A leader who is genuinely virtuous in every moment will eventually face a situation where that virtue becomes a liability, and in that moment, he'll either betray his nature or lose everything. So Machiavelli's solution is calculated. Appear virtuous. Let people see compassion, generosity, religiousness. Let them believe you are the most upright person in the room. But underneath that appearance, maintain the flexibility to act against those virtues when survival demands it. And he points out something uncomfortably true. Most people don't look beneath the surface. They judge by appearances, by results. If a leader seems good and the state is stable, nobody investigates further. Nobody asks hard questions. The appearance of virtue is, for practical purposes, more powerful than virtue itself. But Machiavelli also adds a warning. You must maintain this image carefully. One slip,
one moment where the mask falls publicly and the damage is almost impossible to repair. Because people don't just feel deceived, they feel foolish. And a population that feels foolish becomes hostile fast. The appearance of goodness must be constant. The practice of it, selective.
Machiavelli has a rule that he repeats with almost obsessive intensity. Never, ever rely on borrowed power. He dedicates entire chapters to this. And the target of his fury? Mercenaries, hired soldiers, men who fight not for a cause, not for loyalty, not for country, but for a paycheck. And his reasoning is devastating. Mercenaries, he argues, are useless in war and dangerous in peace. When things are easy, they'll take your money and parade around. But the moment real danger arrives, the moment the fight actually costs something, they disappear. Or worse, they turn on you. He points to Italy as his prime example. The Italian states of his era were drowning in mercenary armies. Every city, every prince, every republic hired foreign soldiers instead of building their own. And what happened? They were conquered, repeatedly, by France, by Spain, by anyone with an actual army bound by something more than gold. Machiavelli's diagnosis is blunt. Italy didn't fall because it lacked wealth. It didn't fall because it lacked culture. It fell because it outsourced the one thing that should never be outsourced: its own defense, its own capacity for force. And this principle extends far beyond the battlefield. Machiavelli warns that any leader who depends on someone else's strength is building on sand. Borrowed armies, borrowed influence, borrowed authority. It all looks solid until the moment you actually need it. And then it crumbles, because the people holding you up have no reason to stay. The lesson he draws is sharp. If you don't own the power you wield, you don't actually have power. You have a lease, and leases expire, usually at the worst possible time. Build your own strength, or be at the mercy of those who have. Machiavelli has no patience for leaders who wait, who hesitate, who see a threat forming on the horizon and decide to monitor the situation. He warns, explicitly, that problems are easiest to solve when they're small and hardest to solve when they're obvious. That's the paradox. Early on, when a threat is still weak, it's hard to see, but it's easy to destroy. Later, when everyone can see it clearly, it's too late. The thing has grown roots. It has momentum, and now dealing with it costs 10 times what it would have before. He compares it to a disease. Physicians, he says, know that illness in its early stages is easy to treat, but hard to diagnose. And in its later stages, easy to diagnose, but almost impossible to cure. Politics works the same way. Power works the same way. And this is where most leaders fail, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack resources, but because they lack nerve. They see something coming and they tell themselves, maybe it'll go away, maybe it won't be that bad, maybe diplomacy will handle it. And by the time they finally act, the window has closed. Rome didn't wait for wars to come to them. When they identified a future threat, they moved. They struck first, not out of aggression for its own sake, but because they understood that delay is never neutral. Delay always favors the enemy. And his advice is unambiguous. A leader who waits for a problem to fully mature before acting isn't cautious, he's negligent. The cost of acting too early is almost always less than the cost of acting too late. Hesitation doesn't protect you, it gives your problems time to grow teeth. Here's something Machiavelli understood that most people don't. Being consistent, in the way most people think about it, is not a virtue, it's a vulnerability. He argues that a leader who is predictable is a leader who can be controlled. Because once people know exactly how you'll react, they can plan around you. They can manipulate you. They can bait you into doing exactly what they want, and you won't even realize it's happening. Think about what that means. Every habit, every pattern, every reliable response becomes a handle.
A lever someone else can pull. And the more powerful you are, the more people are studying those patterns, looking for the exploit. Machiavelli doesn't say this casually. He observed it in every court, every negotiation, every political maneuver he witnessed. The leaders who survived longest were the ones who kept people guessing. Not through chaos, that's amateurish, but through deliberate unpredictability, controlled variation. Enough consistency to maintain trust, but enough variance to prevent anyone from writing a playbook against you. He warns that the moment your rivals know your next move before you make it, you've already lost the advantage. You might still hold the title, you might still sit in the chair, but the real power has shifted to whoever figured you out. And this applies in both directions. Machiavelli also notes that the best strategists are the ones who study the patterns of others. They watch, they catalog, they wait. And when they've mapped the other person's behavior completely, that's when they strike. So the principle cuts both ways. Study others' patterns, guard your own. Be readable enough to be trusted, but never so readable that you can be predicted. Consistency is comfort, and comfort, Machiavelli reminds us, is where power goes to die.
Here's something most people refuse to accept. Politics has never been about what's true. It's about what appears to be true. And Machiavelli understood this better than anyone who came before him, and arguably anyone who came after. He argues that the vast majority of people judge by their eyes, not by their hands, meaning they respond to what they see, not what they can verify. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are, and those few, they don't dare oppose the opinion of the many. That's not a flaw in the system. That is the system. Machiavelli points out that a leader doesn't need to actually possess every virtue: mercy, faithfulness, integrity, humanity, religion. He needs to appear to possess them. And more than that, he needs to know when to drop the appearance and act against those virtues if maintaining them would lead to ruin. Now, this sounds deeply manipulative, and it is. But Machiavelli isn't writing a book on ethics. He's writing a manual on survival. And in the world he observed, a world of shifting alliances, backstabbing diplomats, and fickle public loyalty, appearances weren't just useful, they were essential. He warns that people are so simple, so absorbed by their immediate needs, that a leader who knows how to deceive will always find those willing to be deceived. That's not a hopeful statement, but it's an honest one. And the deeper lesson here? Perception controls reality, not the other way around. A leader can do good and still be destroyed if the public perceives him as weak. A leader can do terrible things and thrive if the narrative is managed well enough. Machiavelli didn't invent political theater. He just refused to pretend it didn't exist. Machiavelli makes a distinction that sounds simple but carries enormous weight. He divides great leaders into two categories: armed prophets and unarmed prophets, and his verdict is absolute. The armed prophets conquered, the unarmed ones were destroyed. He points to Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, and Theseus, men who didn't just have visions, they had armies. They had the means to enforce what they believed, and because of that, their ideas survived, their systems endured, their revolutions held. Then he points the other way to Savonarola, a preacher who captivated Florence, who moved crowds, who reshaped the city's moral order through sheer force of conviction. And what happened? The moment the people stopped believing, he had nothing to fall back on. No arms, no force, no leverage. He was executed, burned in fact.
Machiavelli's lesson here is cold but precise. It's not enough to be right. It's not enough to be persuasive. If you can't compel people to follow you when their enthusiasm fades, and it always fades, you're building on sand. He argues that the nature of people is variable. It's easy to persuade them of something, but it's hard to keep them persuaded. And so, when they stop believing, you must be in a position to make them believe by force.
That word make is doing a lot of heavy lifting, because Machiavelli isn't talking about inspiration. He's talking about infrastructure, the ability to back your ideas with something harder than words. And this applies far beyond armies and kingdoms. Any vision, any movement, any change that relies purely on goodwill without structural power behind it is fragile, dangerously fragile. Machiavelli doesn't celebrate this. He simply observes it. Ideas without enforcement are wishes, and wishes don't survive contact with reality. This might be the hardest pill Machiavelli offers, and it's one that cuts against everything most people are taught from childhood. Be nice, be agreeable, don't make waves, don't be a threat. Machiavelli sees that mindset and calls it what it is, a recipe for subjugation.
He argues that a leader, or anyone navigating a world filled with predatory actors, cannot afford to be harmless, not because aggression is virtuous, but because the absence of danger invites exploitation. People don't respect what they don't fear, and they don't fear what can't hurt them. This is where Machiavelli's concept of virtue becomes critical. It's not virtue in the moral sense. It's something rougher, closer to ferocity.
Competence paired with will, the ability to act decisively, even violently, when the moment demands it. A leader without virtue isn't kind. He's just weak. And weakness, in Machiavelli's world, is the original sin. He warns that those who live in total goodness among so many who are not good will come to ruin. Not might, will. That's not a suggestion. That's a guarantee. And he delivers it with the certainty of someone who's watched it happen over and over again. But here's the nuance people miss. Machiavelli isn't telling you to become cruel. He's telling you to become capable of cruelty. There's a difference. The dangerous person who chooses restraint is respected. The harmless person who has no choice, he's ignored. Or worse, he's used. So his message isn't about abandoning morality. It's about refusing to let morality become a leash. Goodness without strength is a liability, and the leader who doesn't understand that will always serve the one who does. That's Machiavelli's challenge, not to be evil, but to stop being safe. Machiavelli has a line that cuts through centuries of political theory like a blade. Men must be either caressed or destroyed, not managed, not negotiated with endlessly, not kept in some uncomfortable middle ground where they're wounded but still breathing. Because a wounded enemy remembers, and a man who remembers is a man who plans revenge. This is one of Machiavelli's hardest truths, laid out early in The Prince. He argues that when a ruler moves against someone, a rival, a faction, a conquered people, the worst thing he can do is go halfway. Injure them just enough to anger them, but not enough to eliminate the threat. That's not mercy. That's a death sentence you've written for yourself and handed to your enemy to deliver at a time of their choosing. So the choice is binary. Either bring someone fully into your circle, reward them, elevate them, make their loyalty worth more than their rebellion. Or, if they can't be won, remove them completely. No half measures, no lingering threats, no enemies left standing with just enough strength to strike back. And this doesn't apply only to war. Machiavelli's logic extends to every power dynamic: business, politics, alliances. If you betray a partner but leave them with resources and connections, you haven't solved a problem, you've created one, a worse one, because now they're motivated. Most people fail here because they confuse hesitation with compassion. They don't want to be cruel, so they choose the middle path. But Machiavelli warns that the middle path is the cruelest of all. It prolongs conflict, breeds resentment, and guarantees instability. Commit fully, one direction or the other. Win them over completely or take them off the board entirely. Anything in between is just slow failure dressed up as restraint. There is a fantasy that most people carry with them, that if you're kind enough, fair enough, generous enough, people will love you and follow you and never betray you. Machiavelli looked at that fantasy, and he dismantled it. In The Prince, he argues that a ruler who tries to be good in all things will inevitably be destroyed by those who are not good. It's not a theory, it's an observation. He'd watched it happen in Florence, in Rome, across every court and battlefield he'd studied. The nice ruler doesn't get rewarded for his kindness. He gets eaten alive by those who see kindness as an opening. And here's the part that stings. Machiavelli doesn't say good rulers fail because the world is unfair. He says they fail because they're making a strategic error. They're prioritizing how they want to be seen over what needs to be done. They'd rather be loved than effective, and that preference, it's a choice to lose. He points out that generosity, unchecked, leads to ruin. A ruler who gives freely eventually runs out of resources. Then he has to tax harder, and suddenly the generous leader becomes the hated one. The very thing he tried to avoid, he created through his own softness. Same with mercy. Machiavelli argues that a ruler who pardons too freely invites disorder. Crime spreads, factions grow bolder, and the people, the ordinary people who just want stability, they suffer most. So, who's really cruel? The ruler who punishes decisively and maintains order? Or the one who forgives everything and lets chaos reign? Machiavelli isn't telling rulers to be monsters. He's telling them to stop pretending the world rewards goodness automatically. It doesn't. Goodness without power is just a target on your back.